Okay, I think we're going to begin and shift the order of the speakers, okay? So that we won't waste more time. First of all, I've been asked to mention that after this debate or discussion, there will be a reception in the Goldman Lounge, which is just down the hall, and there will be things to drink and eat. So you're welcome to come. Okay, the first speaker by the revised schedule is Eugene Volokh. He teaches free speech law, tort law, religious freedom law, church-state relations at the UCLA School of Law, where he's often also taught copyright law, criminal law, and a seminar on firearms regulation policy. Volokh is the author of 3 textbooks, as well as over 75 law review articles and over 80 op-eds, including 10 law review articles and 12 op-eds on firearm regulation policy. He also serves as a faculty advisor to the NYU Journal of Law and Liberty. Before coming to UCLA, he clerked for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor on the U.S. Supreme Court and for Judge Alex Kozinski on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. And last but not least, his famous blog, The Volokh Conspiracy, is now being hosted by the Washington Post. So now
yes, exactly.
So now let me introduce our first speaker. We've now switched. We're very nimble here. Richard Aborn is president of the Citizens Crime Commission of New York City, a nonprofit focused on criminal justice and public safety policies and practices. Mr. Aborn also serves as president of Constantine and Aborn Advisory Services, which advises police departments, corporations, and other organizations in the United States, Europe, and Latin America on high-level strategy and management issues. From 1992 to 1996, Mr. Aborn was president of Handgun Control Incorporated, now the Brady Campaign, a leading gun control advocacy organization in the United States. In this role, Mr. Aborn was one of the principal strategists behind the passage of the landmark Brady Bill and legislation banning assault weapons and large capacity clips. Mr. Aborn also served as president of the Center to Prevent Handgun Violence. So we'll begin with Richard Aborn, who will speak for 20 minutes. Then Eugene Volokh will speak for 20 minutes, then 5 minutes each for rebuttal, and then open to the audience. Okay? Okay.
We're sitting?
Yeah. Well, if you want,
I'll be standing, but you can stand. I have a PowerPoint, so I need to be up there.
Just because I've been sitting all day. Nice to meet you, by the way.
Good to meet you.
Good afternoon. So the last time I was this late to something was in the middle of a homicide trial. I came back from lunch about 10 minutes late, and this wonderful judge that was trying the case, who was not the most gentle soul in the world, had brought the entire jury in, had brought the defendant in, had brought the defense lawyer in, and he was sitting on the bench, and I walked in, and everybody just looked at me. And the judge said, "Very nice of you to join us, Mr. Aborn. Maybe you might want to put a witness on now." So that was not an auspicious beginning. So I apologize for being late. I thought what might be useful is to take this time and really discuss what the goals are of the gun control movement. And the reason I say that is that this is a policy area, not unlike other areas, that tends to be debated on the fringes, very often on cable stations with 2, quote, talking heads, really sort of firing each other, and the audience hearing just a jumble of words and very little cogent discussion, and with producers yelling in your ear, engage, 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 when in fact you're trying to have a somewhat civilized conversation. It's sort of like crossfires become spitfire. It is just a silly way to try and do this. So the time when you can get some reasoned discussion is in rooms like this, hint, hint. So you don't have that same sort of both vacuous and just terrible kinds of exchange. And I think one of the things that's happened is that because it's much easier for the press to focus on binaries, the gun control issue is no longer about gun control, and I'll tell you why we use that term, despite some of its sort of assigned pejorative applications, is because the press would much rather position this, as would our opponents, as a gun ban versus no restriction debate. And this debate has nothing to do with either it being a gun ban or a no restriction debate. Are there some people in the United States that would like to ban all guns? Of course. Are there some people in the United States who like to have total unfettered access to all sorts of weaponry? Of course. But in a democracy, debates tend to be sort of shaken around for a little while, and then they get settled in the middle. And I want to talk to you about what that looks like from our perspective and why. So I came to this issue, fortunately, not as a victim. I've never been the victim of a gun crime. No one in my family has ever been the victim of a gun crime, I'm very happy to say. But in some broad sense, we are all, or at least we all have been, victims of gun violence. But the reason I came to this debate is that I was a violent crime prosecutor in the DA's office here in Manhattan for years, back when New York still had a lot of violent crime and people were afraid to walk the streets. And just to give you a snapshot, back when there were about 2,200 murders a year, note last year there were less than 400, just a remarkable achievement. And I can show you similar drops in other categories of crime. But because I was doing violent crimes, again, mostly homicides, every single time I went to a homicide scene, I was struck by the fact that the instrumentality of death was a gun. So I went to the then DA, Bob Morgenthau, and said, if we're really going to be true to our calling, which, as you know, the first duty of anyone in law enforcement is to try and prevent crime, we really have to figure out how to get at some of these weapons. Because unless we start deterring the ability of would-be offenders to get their hands on guns, we're going to continue to see these astronomical murder rates, both in our town and throughout the United States. And the other thing that informed that was I was frankly somewhat offended as an American that we were seeing such high rates of death by gun, and I didn't want to feel as though there was something inherently violent about the American character. We were more violent than other people, and as I began to explore some of the international data, I saw very rapidly, without doing point-to-point comparisons, that the rates of interpersonal violence in other countries, in some other countries, was not terribly dissimilar from that in the United States. The big difference was we had unfettered access to guns. A lot of these countries did not, thus lowering the homicide rate. So based on that experience, I started to move a little bit away from criminal justice litigation and move much more towards criminal justice legislation, thinking that a policy solution might have a more widespread application than prosecuting individual cases. As important as that is, I don't decry that function at all. Some of you may know I actually ran for DA in the last go-around, so I fully understand the necessity for the core prosecutorial function, but I think there are also other ways to get at some of these issues. I started getting involved with a group in Washington, which was then a fledgling group called Handgun Control. Handgun Control had been founded by a man named Pete Shields. Pete was a high-ranking, he was 4th or 5th, executive in, that's awful, I'm forgetting the corporation there in Maryland, but I'll think in a second, one of the chemical manufacturers. His son, I don't know if any of you know about this, but was killed in the zebra killings. The zebra killings were a series of gang initiation killings in San Francisco where the putative gang member was assigned the task of going out and assassinating a white person. That was the initiation right. And Pete's son, Pete, DuPont, he was at DuPont. Pete's son, Pete, was shot and killed on his way into his car to, I think, come home or go to class or something. Pete became very outraged by that and founded Handgun Control. The goals of Handgun Control then are actually not dissimilar from the goals of Handgun Control now, the Brady campaign now. And I'd like to walk you through those, and then after the professor goes, perhaps we can have some discussion around that and around some of the very thorny and I think pretty complicated political issues, and including some of the dichotomies in the politics around this issue. So, as I mentioned, I came to this from a law enforcement perspective. And the the policy proposals are not dissimilar, and you'll understand the theory right away. One of the principal things you do in law enforcement when you're dealing with violent crime, or frankly any kind of crime, and it's actually not dissimilar from what you do in epidemiology, is you look for instrumentalities. seatbelt debates, bicycle helmets, all these things, dirty needles, condoms, a lot of these things. You look for causality, instrumentality, investigation, education, gratification. It was clear at that point that the United States had a very major problem with guns, and to me, it was also clear why we had that problem with guns, at least partially why we had that problem with guns. And the reason was there was essentially no federal law impacting the distribution of the guns most often used in crime, and there was a crazy patchwork of laws and regulations at the state, county, city, town, village level. At one point, we actually counted them, and there were some 30,000 different laws governing the distribution of guns. So you can well imagine that it was impossible to do any national enforcement, very almost impossible to do any state enforcement. There was some city enforcement. And gun traffickers found it very easy to go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, gathering many, many guns to sell on the streets, and in fact would do that. When I was in the DA's office, I ran one of the first gun task forces designed to really try and ferret out where the guns were coming from, and I had an informant who I remember well to this day and stayed in touch with for a long time, who was working for us, who was out selling guns on the street. This guy was literally like a salesman. He'd go around and either take orders and then drive down south to a particular location and buy his guns in bulk and drive them back to New York, or he would go down to the same location, buy 100 guns of different kinds, and he had a bunch of cases, and he would go up to certain locations in Manhattan, open up the trunk of his car and say, like a Sunday afternoon fair, come and see what I've got. And he would move lots of guns in the market. We would then follow those and start making arrests. And it became clear from that there were a lot of traffickers on the East Coast going up and down I-95, which we came to affectionately refer to as the Iron Pipeline, buying guns in bulk from states that had virtually no gun control laws, and bringing them to New York, a state that even back then, actually since 1911, has had very, very strong gun control laws. And that sent me a very clear message, which was there was no way we were going to legislate our way out of this problem at the local or state level. We had to do this nationally. When I first got involved in this debate, there was not even a requirement that there be a background check before you could buy a gun. There was no requirement that there be a background check before you could buy a gun. You could be a felon convicted of multiple robberies, having done your time, totally prohibited from buying guns under the 1968 legislation, and yet you could go anywhere, fill out a federally mandated form in which, among other things, you swore, because it was a sworn statement, that you'd never been convicted of a felony, raise your right hand, say it's true, and now say, give me my 9mm. That was nuts. That was nuts. So the starting out point for the gun control movement was the Brady Bill, which is now law in this country, which does no more than require a background check, and it's done in different ways, before somebody can purchase a gun or guns. We also passed, right after that, we then switched to what was a big issue at the time, which was the semi-automatic assault weapon and the large capacity magazine in a terrifically difficult fight coming on the heels of an already terrifically difficult political fight. We passed the ban on assault weapons and the ban on large magazines, but in retrospect, unfortunately, we had a compromise with our Senate sponsor and agreed to apply a 10-year sunset clause to the Senate bill. Otherwise, we could not pick up 3 critical votes that we needed in the Senate. And when I finally reluctantly agreed to this thing, I thought to myself, well, no president 10 years from now, this is 94, was going to put these guns back on the street. No one would be that nuts. Here we are, those guns went right back on the streets in 2004 under President Bush and Congress at that time. We all make mistakes. So where would the gun control movement like to go? Here's what the goals are, and here's why we think they make sense. Remember I said that people were going from New York State, it was down to South Carolina to buy guns, and the reason was there was a total paucity of gun control laws in South Carolina. Well, that sort of modeling continues to resonate loudly in our heads. We see that the states that have strong laws tend to deter, I don't want to say stop, but deter criminals from getting guns in gun stores and from gun shops within those states, force them either to gun shows or to states with weak laws, now increasingly to the internet. And we thought, well, it'd be much better if we had the New York model at the national level with some attributes deleted and some attributes probably added. So probably our single largest goal is to get a national licensing requirement, so that before you can buy a gun, you have to get a license. We have to figure out the legal issues around this, but either from the state or from the federal government. And as a predicate to getting that license, you would have to go through some safety training. We think just going through those steps would have a positive impact on illegal trafficking. One thing you have to keep in mind about guns in America that's actually sharply different from narcotics is that while we have a very large illegal narcotics problem in the United States, many of those narcotics, in fact I think probably an overwhelming number, come in from foreign shores, from foreign countries through numerous porous points in the boundaries, in the border surrounding the United States. Very hard to stop. Very, very hard to stop. That's wholly different than the gun issue. Guns, by and large, particularly crime guns, are manufactured here legally. They are sent by a wholesaler legally to retailers who are allowed to sell them legally. So we're not dealing with foreign illegal markets here. So we have to focus on that moment when a gun goes in a retail shop or at a gun show, from a moment, if you will, of legality to illegality. That's the point that we have to break up. And that's really where we have focused our efforts. And we think licensing would have some impact on that, as would a registration requirement for reasons that we can get into. We would also like to see there be mandatory safety training as a predicate to the license. And the reason that I say that is there are lots and lots of issues, obviously, around the possession of a gun in the home. I'm sure you've all read the stories of parents who keep their guns out because they think they're going to need it in the middle of the night to shoot an intruder, where that gun happens all the time now, where that gun gets found by a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, is either curious about it or even thinks it's a toy, picks it up and not purposely points it at somebody, pulls the trigger, and the 5-year-old has just killed another 5-year-old, and very often it's a sibling killing another sibling. It's horrific, and what's so aggravating about it is that it's preventable. So another requirement we would like to see, which obviously would be trained in the safety training, is that gun owners be required to secure their firearms in a way that an unattended child can't get to that. And there are lots of ways you can do that and still leave the weapon accessible should you need it in a relatively quick time. I will tell you parenthetically, I work with police agencies all around the world, including ours here. And one of the things they always train their officers is to really stop and reflect before you pick up a weapon in the middle of the night and pull the trigger. Many agencies direct their officers to keep their guns unloaded. You keep the bullets nearby, you keep the clip nearby, but to keep it unloaded just to give you a moment of reflection before you make that irredeemable decision to pull that trigger. Because this ain't a knife, this is a gun. Once that trigger's pulled, you're not calling that bullet back. So we would like to see that as well. We would also like to see a reinstatement of the ban on large magazines. The magazine is the cylinder, the metal cylinder that goes inside a semi-automatic weapon, mostly on the crime side, 9mm. It's the gun the cops carry, that carries the bullets. Right now there's no limitation on the size of that magazine, and you see magazines of all sizes being used in crime. 10s, 15s, 16s, 34s, 64s, there's even a 100-round magazine that goes in a riot gun. Those are perfectly legal now. We ban them, but they are now perfectly legal under federal law. Some states, including ours, have banned them separately. We would like to see the ban on large magazines reinstated. Again, during the Q&A, I can walk you through the reasons why, but I think it's almost self-evident that a, quote, law-abiding citizen doesn't need more than 10 rounds to hunt. In fact, in most states, you're not even allowed to carry more than 10, sometimes not more than 3 rounds to hunt, and you don't even need more than 10 rounds to act in self-defense. You can carry multiple clips if you think you need to. We think the decrease in firepower would have a very positive impact in a lot of these mass shootings, and certainly in assaults on cops and assaults on civilians, because you get these horrific shootouts out there. We do believe that the ban on assault weapons should be reinstated. We think that would be an important step to take forward towards public safety. And then there are a few other measures that we think would really directly impact the markets. There are 2 of those that I think are principally important. Some of these we have passed at the state level. The first is to to restrict the sale of handguns and probably long guns at gun shows. You know what gun shows are? Anybody not know what a gun show was? Are you a shy audience? You all know what gun shows are? Yes? Okay. So to ban the sale, to restrict the sale of guns at gun shows to FFLs. FFLs are federal firearms licensees. They are the people licensed by the federal government to sell guns. They are the ones that have computer access to the background check system. That's all done by computer. So to restrict those sales, the reason we would like to do that is that we know from far too many investigations that the bad guys will often go to gun shows, bulk up on guns because there's 0 restriction on your ability to do that, and again, load those guns into a car and drive those guns to a place where they need to sell those weapons because they're engaged in commerce. They're selling those guns to make a profit. The other piece that we would like to do is a law we call 1 gun a month, but in essence it means you would restrict the number of guns that anyone could buy at any one time to 1 to 5 or some small number. And the reason you would do that would be to get at the economics of this. So gun trafficking, like any other business, legal or illegal, is all about making a profit. And the reason that gun traffickers can make a profit is that they can go again to these states with very weak gun control laws, buy what's called a gun in the box, meaning a brand new gun, for some relatively modest sum, and then come back to the streets of New York, we see this all the time, and sell those guns at a very handsome markup. And obviously, like any business, the more volume you can push, the more profitable is the transaction. So we want to at least we want to take the profit motivation out of it. And we think one of the best ways to do that, and there's some history around this, would be to restrict the number of sales at any one time to 1, maybe 3. After you get beyond 3, maybe the profit margin is enough to do it. And guns are not traded either by cartels or on the same massive volume the way drugs are distributed. So we think that would have a very big impact on the illegal markets. And then there's some other minor laws that we think should be passed, but probably are not critical to the overall national debate. That is, by and large, where the gun control movement would like to end up. And the reason we chose the term gun control as opposed to gun ban is that this is about controlling guns. Again, I came to this issue, and I've been into this issue for a while, because I saw the law enforcement use. I saw the guns on the street. This is about breaking up the illegal markets in guns. This is about stopping gun traffickers and those who would do great harm to others from using guns to carry that arm. This is an ironic statement, but you may have noticed in New York, in the last 30 or 45 days, while there have been a number of homicides, we have seen a somewhat significant increase in stabbings as opposed to the use of guns. Some of the stuff that's happening out there is really beginning to work, and I can show you some trend data or discuss with you some trend data that I think really amplifies that point. But the core point is that the legislative proposals, the things that we want, are things that we think are incredibly reasonable, are not unknown in other areas of our daily lives, and certainly are not unknown to the legislature at the national level or even the state levels, and things that we believe are well thought out to have a positive impact on the amount of illegal trafficking in the United States. I cannot say emphatically enough that this is not a ban movement. There is very little popular support for a ban. There are very few leaders of the gun control movement that support a ban. I do not support a ban. No one's ever heard me support a ban. There is absolutely no way a ban would ever pass. It's just a foolhardy dream. But most of all, the most important thing is the policy doesn't require it. Because the good news is, while we are a very heavily armed country, very heavily armed, maybe as many 300 million guns in this country, not 300 million gun owners, but 300 million guns. That's a lot of guns. The vast majority of guns that are held by the so-called law-abiding citizen, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, people that comply with the law, are held safely, are used for sport, hunting, target shooting, whatnot. Some keep the gun in the house for self-defense, but rarely do those guns, it happens, but rarely do those guns get used inappropriately in an act of violence or in some of the other horrors that I mentioned. So we really don't need to interfere with the law-abiding citizen's ability to get a gun. We do need to interfere with the ability of the criminal to get a gun. I don't think, I don't need to remind you about Sandy Hook. I really don't. It's, if you think for 1 second about that, you think about, what are we doing here? And just remember that in the wake of Sandy Hook, our Congress stood still. Our president pushed, but our Congress stood still. And we need to think about that. We need to think about whether or not we can have no response to the death of those 24 people, 20 of whom were, about this day, and about as innocent as they come. So it's really time for the United States to engage in what I believe should be a rational discussion. I would love to see the two sides get together. There is ample room for compromise on this topic, ample room for compromise on this topic, and really move from the binary into a robust discussion in the middle, which I think we can have, and move the country forward. We can achieve even greater levels of public safety than we've already achieved. But unless and until we get our hands around illegal guns, that won't happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just pull up the latest PowerPoint. Sorry. I was on the computer editing my PowerPoints in light of the comments, because I like to be dynamic in my responses. So thank you very much for having me here. This is a very interesting topic. It's one I very much like to talk about, and I mostly like to talk about not so much debate about what this particular narrow proposal, whether it's a good idea or not, but just the big picture, because I think a lot of people aren't up on the big picture. And I should say also, I do think that the positions that Richard Aborn has set forth here are ones that, I probably wouldn't go for most of those proposals, but they aren't the ones that I think are terribly bad either. I think it's an interesting question. Right now we are at a relatively modest a level of modest proposals. And I do think that people are interested. Well, what about more aggressive proposals? Some people have made them. What should our response be? And most of my talk will be just trying to set forth what I understand to be a lot of the data about guns. I should also say I very much appreciate the public service that Richard has done in the past as a prosecutor. I think it's tremendously important job. When I went to law school, I wanted to be a prosecutor. I was lured away by the legal academy, but it's very important work that prosecutors do. So, guns in America. Some facts about guns in America. So first, about 40 to 45% of all households have a gun. There are about 300 million guns out there. I used to ask people questions, and they would guess 5 million, 10 million. Then they started guessing 300 million because it'd been in the news much, and now Richard has let the cat out of the bag. Sorry. About 11,000 intentional gun homicides per year, about 3.6 per 100,000 people. That's 2000 data. It's a little lower now. Sorry, no, 2010 data, so it's about the same now. 19,000 suicides per year. There are about 600 fatal gun accidents per year. Richard mentioned accidents involving shootings of small children. There's, of course, tragedies. There are 60 of them per year. Every one of them is a tragedy, but this is not a tail that I think should be wagging the dog in a lot of these things. The real question I think a lot of people have is, what can we do about these 11,000 intentional gun homicides? Some people ask about suicides, I think both for normative reasons and practical reasons. I don't think that should be the focus either. Occasionally you hear people talking about 30,000 gun deaths a year. That the number comes from that, and about almost 2/3 of them are suicides. There are serious non-fatal injuries per year, about 6,500 accidents, 30,000 assaults, and 3.2 thousand suicide attempts, and if you're shooting at someone who wants to be shot, which is to say yourself, then the chances are a lot higher that the suicide attempt will succeed. For non-fatal, for accidents and for assaults, the ratio is different. Okay, there are about a little under 500,000 non-homicide gun crimes per year. One thing that's interesting about this is there are 300 million guns. Every year, at least 299.5 million of them are not used in crimes, in homicides and suicides or in accidents. Probably a little higher because you'd think, we don't know for sure, but you'd think a lot of these crimes are committed with the same gun. So a gun does multiple duty there. So really, even if you look over the lifespan of a gun, well over 90% of all guns out there never used in crime or in any other such outcome, which explains, I think, some of the political reality that Richard's describing, that a lot of people aren't terribly keen, knowing that they're responsible gun owners, aren't terribly keen on having their guns be taken away because of abuse by a small group of people. Relatedly, even if somehow we can wave a magic wand, let's say let's assume there's a total gun ban, as some have argued. I'm glad Richard isn't arguing for, but let's assume there was one, and 3/4 of those guns were turned in immediately. I'm not sure that's really that likely, but let's say that 75 million guns would be enough to satisfy the criminal needs of America's gun criminals for a very, very long time. So those are just some realities that one needs to keep in mind. There also are anywhere from 80,000 to 2.5 million defensive gun users per year. 80,000 numbers from the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is a credible source. 2.5 million was from a study by Gary Kleck, who is a very prominent and award-winning criminologist, generally a gun control skeptic. Phil Cook, generally a gun control supporter, tried rerunning that study and got about 1.5 million. Now, Cook argues, I think quite plausibly, that as with all surveys, it's often really hard to tell for sure whether people are telling you the truth. Some of them are drunk, lying, crazy. Very hard to tell. And this just reflects that it's often very hard to tell about a lot of things. This having been said, defensive gun users are out there, and that's a big reason why a lot of people do have guns. Important gun laws in America: home possession of rifles and shotguns is legal everywhere. Home possession of handguns was legal almost everywhere except in Chicago and DC and a few other places. Now it's legal everywhere, but apparently a hassle, I'm told, in New York, especially New York City, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. So right to carry concealed handguns, this is what it was like in, let me move it up. This is what it was like in 1986, that about 9 states were blue or green, which is to say that any law-abiding adult could either get a license to carry concealed, or in the green state, Vermont, didn't even need a license. You didn't need a license to do that. And red was no right carry at all, and yellow was its discretionary, and often in many places basically in practice never given. And this is what's been happening. This is the hidden story, the often untold story of gun control, and it's a story of gun decontrol. Right now it's shifted from 9 states that allowed anybody to get a concealed carry license to all but 8 states that do that. And that's been, I think, a very substantial move in gun control policy. Okay, so that's the big picture. Now, people say, well, what can we do about those 11,000 homicides? What can we do about those 600 accidents? Some people ask the same about suicides. I think the first answer is you ought to ask the right question. And the question is, what are the costs and benefits of a proposed policy? And you might say, well, that's kind of obvious, Volokh. Well, it is obvious, but often people don't ask that question. They ask, what are, for example, the costs and benefits of the regulated activity? Or they ask, would we be better off in a blank-free world? Think back almost 100 years now to Prohibition. The question was, some people asked, would we be better off in an alcohol-free world? Quite possibly. Turns out we now know that alcohol used in moderation has some health benefits. It surely has huge costs. Costs in homicide, costs in ruined lives of children, costs in non-homicide crimes, vast range of costs. So we might say that the benefits of alcohol are outweighed by the costs. We'd be better off in an alcohol-free world, but that's not an available world to us. So we learned from Prohibition, and Prohibition was pretty quickly repealed because it was seen that the costs of the policy were actually much greater than the benefits that were actually realized. The other thing you need to do is you need to distinguish correlation from causation. And I like to show this picture. The solid line is the forcible rape rate. The dotted line is ice cream production. There's a pretty high correlation here. I take it we would be cautious, though, to infer that ice cream production causes forcible rape. One thing you might see is there's higher incidence in the warm months. Maybe more people are out, more possible opportunities for criminals to commit this crime. Hard to tell, but suffice it to say, and again this is kind of obvious but people often miss it, is we need to be cautious about that. Another thing we need to do is we need to consider substitution effects. So here's an example, proposal to ban Saturday night specials. And I believe that at least in the 90s, that Handgun Control Incorporated, I think when you were in charge of it, backed, I think it was under Brady 2, a ban on Saturday night specials. These are cheap handguns. They're supposedly lower quality, and probably that's right. They are smaller, and my understanding is they're generally mostly low caliber. Certainly many definitions of Saturday night specials ended up being mostly low caliber handguns. And the argument was they are the preferred guns of criminals. I'm not sure that's right. The data that I've seen suggests that criminals like good, solid, reliable guns just as much as the rest of us do. But let's say that's right. Now, one possible reaction is the naive view, which is if you ban Saturday night specials, the people who own Saturday night specials will stop committing gun crimes. I don't think that was ever the view of serious gun control advocates, because obviously not everybody will comply. So you might say there's another view. Some won't comply with a ban, but hey, that's okay. Laws can be useful even if they're not completely complied with. There's always going to be some non-compliance with murder laws, robbery laws, and such. Better some than none. But here's another possible view. What if some won't comply with the Saturday night special ban? Some won't commit gun. So in other words, they will just keep the same guns as before. Some will shift away from gun crimes, and some would switch to other guns which might actually be more lethal. Guns that are indeed longer, and there's as a general matter, they could still be concealable, but they are more accurate and more likely to be lethal. Higher muzzle velocity, tend to be higher caliber, tend to be better made, more likely to hit the target. If some of the criminals shift away from the banned gun to another gun that is equally lethal, no effect of the law. If they shift away to a gun that's more lethal, it could be a perverse effect. Another thing that's important, let me actually skip this. Another thing that's important is disaggregate possible effects. And I wrote in terms of the handgun ban, you can say the same about assault weapons ban and such. So some people ask, well, how will it affect crime and death? I think that's not quite right. You want to know how it will affect particular kinds of crimes. For example, how will it affect gun accidents? It's complicated, right? Because especially if you consider substitution effects. If people stop having handguns and instead get shotguns, maybe some people won't shoot themselves as much because it's harder to point a shotgun at yourself. Very possible, but harder than with a handgun. On the other hand, if they by accident shoot somebody else, a shotgun is a more lethal weapon, materially more lethal weapon than a handgun. So a handgun ban might have actually no effect on gun accidents, or actually increase gun accidents, assuming the people who can't get handguns don't say, okay, I give up, I won't have any gun, but instead shift to their second best alternative. Gun suicides, I would say again, no effect or possibly a bad effect. Again, to the extent that you think that handgun owners won't just say, hey, if it's not a handgun for me, it's nothing. Shotgun suicides, see Kurt Cobain, Ernest Hemingway, are basically, with either one you can kill yourself. With a shotgun, it's probably a little bit more reliable. Gun homicides and crimes at home, again, virtually no effect. Again, assuming, and in fact some of the advocates of handgun bans have said, well, that's okay because you can still have a shotgun to defend yourself. Advocates of assault weapons bans say, quite plausibly, it's okay, you can have other weapons to defend yourself. Well, if that's right, presumably people will switch to those other weapons. And at home, again, this might make it more lethal. If your worry is about somebody killing a spouse or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a family member in a moment of rage, you'd rather that the person not be armed with a shotgun, where the lethality, hard to tell for sure, but we think it's probably about 50 to 60% instead of 15 to 20% as it is for a handgun. Now, gun homicides and crimes in public might be more affected because handguns are easier to conceal than shotguns. But again, you want to distinguish. Small-time criminals, those are the ones most likely to comply with the law. Serious criminals, a lot less likely to comply with the law. If you're an armed robber and are willing to flout the laws against armed robbery, then unless there's a very aggressive stop and frisk regime out there, you're probably going to be willing to comply with the laws against carrying handguns. Mass shooters, I'd say no effect at all. Of all of the people that you might hope to deter through gun control laws, I would think that mass shooters are the hardest. These are people who have already committed themselves to either ending their life or ruining their life, as well as, of course, killing lots of people. It's hard to see how it is that gun control laws will have much of an effect. And it'll also affect homicides and crimes averted by defensive users, again at home and in public. At home, not so much, because people would be able to possess shotguns to defend themselves. In public, potentially quite a lot. Now, another question people ask is, are guns effective for self-defense? We don't know, because it's a very hard thing to measure. The best evidence that we have is from data that reports on injury rate following self-defense using particular weapons. The problem is there's a correlation-causation problem. Maybe those situations where somebody could use a gun were situations where they weren't surprised, let's say. Or maybe the kind of people who carry guns may be more able to defend themselves in general. Very hard to tell. But the best data we have suggests that guns dramatically decrease, or are associated, let's say, with a dramatic decrease in injury rates for assault, and a substantial decrease in injury rates compared to no defense for robbery. And one other way of thinking about it is, I don't know how many of you have houses, probably not a lot in New York. In LA, lots of people have houses. There are signs. Some say protected by armed patrol. None say protected by unarmed patrol. Why? If guns were really ineffective at self-defense, it's not like security guards, well, they're super trained ninjas. No, not security guards. Probably not even police officers, but certainly not security guards. All right. A few other things. Who are the gun killers? Well, it turns out most of them, the overwhelming majority of them, have had lots of brushes with the criminal justice system. 80% have adult arrest records. 70% have adult conviction records. If you include juvenile justice interactions, there would be an even higher number, although we don't know how many, because those records are generally sealed. So most gun killers are probably unlikely to abide by gun control laws. You can imagine some that might. Somebody who is otherwise law-abiding, but then in a moment of anger, if he has a gun, shoots someone, but if he didn't have the gun, well, then he wouldn't have. Possible, probably not very likely. Gun robbers, even more so. Because again, for those people, the gun is the tool of the trade. And it's pretty unlikely that they'll give it up. Now, a lot of people point out, as Richard did, that America has a higher homicide rate than many other many other Western countries. It includes countries like Japan, Australia, Europe, and such. Well, the most comprehensive study that I've seen by a pro-gun control criminologist, Martin Killias, actually went through 21 countries and found no statistically significant correlation between gun ownership and total suicide, homicide, assault, and robbery. Did find some statistically significant correlations between gun ownership and homicide by handgun and a few other such things as to particular demographic groups. But the total, which is what matters to us, because to the extent that homicide by handguns shift over to homicide by knife, the people are just as dead. The hope of gun control or lower gun ownership is homicide by handgun will be decreased, homicide by knife might be increased a little bit as a substitution effect, but not that much. That's the hope. He found no evidence for realization of this hope, even in this international comparison. Likewise, if you look at continental Europe, you see some countries, this is from an earlier time, the United States had a 5.4 homicide rate, a lot higher, 40% gun ownership. Well, Norway, 36% gun ownership, homicide rate 0.81, near the very bottom. Hungary, 2.22%, gun ownership 2%. Germany, another example of a relatively high gun ownership rate, though not as high as in the US, very low homicide rate. So I'm not sure about comparative evidence. But let me give you one other example. There's this famous Seattle-Vancouver study. It's now about 30 years old, so just to give it as an example. They found Seattle had at that point, and this was at the peak of the American homicide rate, 11.3 homicides per 100,000 people, and Vancouver had 6.9. But among whites, if you control for demographics, Seattle 6.2, Vancouver 6.4. Part of the problem is there are very different patterns of crime, different patterns of gangs, which are often quite closely racially linked. If you were just to say, look, let's look at these cities and we control roughly for things like income and for location, you might see a strong correlation. If you control for other factors, that disappears. All right. The other thing, of course, to remember is that even if greater gun ownership caused more homicide or crime, even if there was some, not just correlation, but actual causation, it's not clear, given the 300 million guns out there, that there's a lot that's likely to be done about it. Okay, so let me finish up by a few of the specific points that Richard pointed to. Assault weapons bans. So here's from the 1994 ban. The term semi-automatic assault weapon means any of the firearms or copies and duplicates of particular firearms, or a semi-automatic rifle that has an ability to accept a detachable magazine, which most semi-automatics do, and at least two of a pistol grip, a bayonet mount, a grenade launcher. First thing is, a lot of people think assault weapons are machine guns. They're not. By definition, in part because machine guns have been nearly banned and very heavily regulated since the 1930s and especially since the 1980s. By definition, these are semi-automatic. They're not that, the underlying structure is no different from that of a vast range of other semi-automatic weapons. And some of these things are, again, hard for me to see a bayonet mount, grenade launcher. What is that going to do? Of course, a grenade launcher can help you launch grenades, but grenades are already banned. We have a lot of gun crime, I gotta admit. We don't have much grenade crime, fortunately. So this, I think, is an illustration that, while on the one hand, assault weapons bans indeed will not much interfere with self-defense because you've got guns that are pretty much equivalent that are not banned. On the other hand, they won't much interfere with crime because you've got guns that are pretty much equivalent that are not banned. If a criminal says, look, I can't get an assault weapon anymore, I'm going to get one that doesn't have a bayonet mount, doesn't have a grenade launcher, doesn't have a pistol grip, no material effect. Here's Charles Krauthammer. The assault weapons ban, this is writing around the time of the ban was first enacted, will have no significant effect either on crime rate or personal security. But it's a good idea because it desensitizes the public to the regulation of weapons in preparation for their ultimate confiscation. I'm pleased that Richard isn't in favor of bans on guns, but there are people who not only are, but have argued that one advantage of assault weapons bans is precisely that. Now, Krauthammer's a columnist. Here is, I think, Josh Sugarman of the Violence Policy Center. Assault weapons, I'm sorry, I may have mistyped the date. It may have been 1988. Assault weapons are quickly becoming the leading topic of America's gun control debate. Such a shift will not only damage Americans' guns lobby, but strengthen the handgun restriction lobby for the following reasons. Weapons' menacing looks, coupled with the public's confusion over fully automatic machine guns versus semi-automatic assault weapons, can only increase the chance of public support for restriction of these weapons. Well, how about Pete Shields, whom we heard mentioned? Now, I don't for a moment want to, actually, let me skip this. I don't for a moment want to suggest that Richard agrees with everything that Pete Shields argued, but let me point to, I did this out of order, sorry. Let me point to a quote from him, to be sure in the 1970s. Maybe he's changed his mind, maybe others of his allies have changed his mind, but he came up, I think, as a positive model. We're going to have to take one step at a time, and the first step is necessarily going to be very modest. We'll have to start working to strengthen the law. We'll go not even with a half a loaf, we'll go with a slice, but eventually our final problem is to make possession of all handguns totally illegal. Now again, maybe that's been renounced by everyone, but that's something that people understandably worry about. I should mention my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, in the Connecticut Law Review Symposium just in November, one of the things you pointed out was that, in fact, it's unlikely that people shouldn't worry about handgun bans because of DC versus Heller and McDonald, that say that handgun bans are unconstitutional. And I think that's right for now, although it's a 5-4 decision, right? And, Hillary Clinton is elected in 2016, Justice Scalia, let's say, retires. It's just possibilities, perfectly plausible possibilities. Easily be 5-4 the other way. And Richard, unless I'm mistaken, you wrote recently an article about how the court ought to reverse DC control. And that's a perfectly plausible position to take. One could say, look, as a constitutional matter, I don't support handgun bans, but I think that shouldn't be something that the Constitution is interpreted as prohibiting. But I hope you can see why it is that people who care about gun possession and gun rights worry about that. So let me close with a couple of items. First, if you're interested in this, read Firearms and Violence, a Critical Review. This is from National Research Council and National Academies. It's from 2004. They went through a whole bunch of policies and a whole bunch of studies studying them, such as assault weapons bans. And the result was there's no evidence that any of this works. It's possible that there's just the evidence hasn't been developed. I'm certainly open to that. But the case for the effectiveness of any of these measures has yet to be made, at least as a scientific matter. Even, for example, assault weapon, one study that was, one researcher who was quoted by Senator Feinstein, whose earlier article was quoted by Senator Feinstein as supporting an extension or reinstitution of an assault weapons ban, acknowledged that we cannot clearly credit the ban with any of the nation's recent drop in gun violence. So let me then just close with this point. People say, well, Volokh, what should we do? If you think that all these gun controls won't work, well, what should we do? What kind of gun controls would do work? And I think the answer is we shouldn't ask what kind of gun controls work. We should ask what kind of policies work. And something works. 1993, homicide deaths, firearm homicide deaths, 7.0. 2010, 3.6, cut by a factor of 2. Non-fatal violent firearm crime, 725.3 to 181.5, cut by a factor of 4. Serious violent crime against youths aged 12 to 17, firearm crime, cut by a factor of 20. I wish I knew what worked, what happened here. It's pretty clear it wasn't gun control. This, as I said, was an era. In fact, if anything, there was more gun decontrol than there was gun control. But something's working. We should certainly be looking at what it is that's working, because we'd like to keep it happening and we'd like to strengthen it as much as possible. But my sense, from all the data that I have seen, and from the conclusions of studies such as this one, there was a similar Centers for Disease Control study around the same time, is whatever's going to be working, it probably won't be gun controls.
Oh, we doing it?
Yeah.
If you want to take 5 minutes.
Or if you want to, I'd happily, both of us skip it and we work into Q&A.
Well, I'll just.
All right.
I'll just do one. Oh, maybe 2.
Okay.
So, you know what, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, I know why you do it, but what you just saw is a classic illustration of exactly how I opened this conversation, which is that the other side, if I may put you on the other side, those who oppose gun control laws, almost never discuss the elements that we put out there as a prescription for reducing some of this violence. They try and use the straw man of the ban, and I'm not going to fall for it. I'm not going to do it. I've never done it. I'm not going to do it now. This is not about banning all guns. This is about regulating guns. And the reason is, what I said earlier, and the professor reaffirmed it, the vast majority of guns that are held by law-abiding citizens never end up in an act of criminality or suicide, etc. There are things we can do to reduce that a lot, and we should, but this is not about banning guns. I don't know how many times to say that. And I know you don't know this, even though you seem to be tracking what I'm saying out there. Pete Shields renounced, and I suspect you know this, Pete Shields renounced that position. He said that.
Happy to hear it.
He said that Pete's passed away.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So Pete said that slightly after his son was killed. Frankly, any of us may have said something in those circumstances, and I'm sure you understand why that would happen. Pete did renounce that long after he got into this movement, and he understood the futility of it, the lack of necessity for it. So again, this is not about banning guns. It's much easier to argue against a ban than it is to argue against, I think, the very reasonable positions that we put out there and that are supported by the overwhelming number of American people. So I won't do a full 5 minutes. We should get into Q&A.
Sounds good. I won't do a full 5 minutes either. So again, I'm pleased to hear that your position, I take it, is that DC v. Heller should be overturned and that cities should be free to institute gun bans, handgun bans, and presumably all total gun bans, but that's a bad policy.
This is a parallel universe. I didn't say anything close to that.
No?
I've written an article,
Yeah.
I think a pretty carefully researched article that looks at Heller and makes arguments about the conditions under which it may be overturned, which I think it should be.
Yeah.
But it has nothing to do, you can't then make the jump and say, well, therefore you support a ban. I do not support a ban, and I defy you to find any place where I've said I support a ban. I think DC versus Heller should be overturned because I think the court was wrong in saying that there's an individual right. I do think it's a collective right under the Second Amendment, and I worry that DC Heller and its growing progeny are going to drain just enormous resources from an already strapped movement to defend this.
Got it. Okay, so I thought I was trying to say, it sounds like your view is that cities should have the constitutional power to institute handgun bans and even total gun bans, but you think it would be unwise for them to try to do that.
I believe that Heller was wrongly decided for the reasons I've said. We do not support a ban for the 500th time.
Okay.
We've never supported a ban. Yes, if Heller is repealed, overturned, excuse me, then the states would be free to do
Okay.
So I'm pleased to hear that. I thought it was helpful to talk about handgun bans because I will tell you, when I go out there and talk to people, I think that's what a lot of people think. When the argument is, well, why not make us like Europe? It's not, well, Europe has background checks. Or why not make us like Japan or England? It's not that they have background checks. When people bring up, and Richard didn't focus on this, but lots of people do, when they bring up the analogies of other countries, it sounds to me like the question is, and it's a reasonable question, why not have it? Now, I'm told that, in fact, that if these policies are instituted, the handgun control movement will fold up its tent, or gun control movement fold up its tent, and so at least go home short of a ban on all guns, or presumably all handguns. They are in favor of a ban on assault weapons, which I did try to talk about. They used to be in favor of a ban on so-called Saturday night specials, which I mentioned. As to one gun a month, if that were the magnitude of the debate, I don't think I'd be here to have this debate. I'm not sure that it's a great idea, and I'm not sure it's going to be terribly effective, chiefly for the reason that I started with, right? If you've got 300 million guns out there, and you're talking about guns that are being used to supply career criminals, gang members, and the like, I find it hard to see how you can do that much about the black market, which already exists. That's where a lot of felons get their guns, and which will further flourish if you try to restrict it. But again, if that were the magnitude, the real scope of the debate, and assault weapons bans were off the table, and the other bans and aggressive restrictions were off the table, then again, I think that would be a very different shape to the debate. But now I think there's time for Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Well, Q&A. Yes.
So I have a couple questions for Professor Volokh.
Volokh. Rhymes with Pollock.
Professor Volokh. A couple questions. So first off, I know that, as we just saw, it's very difficult to have this debate because it seems like everyone's talking past each other. How do you get to, and I think you just mentioned some common ground that people can agree on. I mean, it seems like when the debate was in the Senate, the two sides sort of just talked past each other. One side was saying there's going to be a complete ban. The other side was saying that they want to destroy America and allow handguns everywhere. So is there a way to talk about this in a rational universe where both sides say we're going to forget the two crazy arguments we're both making and agree on something in the middle?
Well, I don't think the sides are irrational, nor do I think the arguments crazy. I don't think it's crazy to say, why don't we have a gun policy? Again, people do it all the time, like that of England or that of Japan, which is generally an extremely broad restriction approaching a total ban on all guns. It's not crazy. I think it's unwise, and I think it's politically unlikely in the country as a whole, maybe more likely in particular places, as we saw with handgun bans in Chicago and DC. So let me tell you, my colleague Adam, pardon?
How do you move past
Yeah,
that?
so my colleague Adam Winkler mentioned, had an op-ed around the time of when there was this talk post Sandy Hook of, among other things, banning assault weapons and instituting comprehensive background checks. That is to say, background checks for sales by private sellers and not just by federal sellers. By professional sellers. And what he said is the assault weapons ban poisoned the well. That assault weapons at this point are actually a lot more common than they actually even were in 1994. In part because whenever there's talk of a ban, a lot of them are sold. My understanding is it's like 10 to 20% of all new rifles that are sold are of those models because they really are not that much different from others. It's just that some people like them for whatever reason or want to get them precisely because it's now or never. And he said, look, the other side kept, or the anti-control side, the gun control skeptics kept saying, the administration wants to take away your guns. Maybe not all guns, but the guns that you've been liking and buying. And nobody's coming to take away your guns. And something happened. They came to try to take away people's guns. And that poisoned the well for what might have been enacted. I will tell you, if there is a proposal at some point for background checks that really are not just for professional sellers and for private sellers, coupled with a proposal to actually give something to the gun rights movement, I think it might get enacted. Not if it's tied together in the public debate with something that I think people aren't buying. I'll give you an example, and look, certainly lots of people would disagree, but here's an example. Generally speaking, if you want a compromise, it's not like, well, I want to restrict everything or a lot. You want to restrict nothing, so let's just restrict a little. An effective compromise is I want to restrict something, you want to de-restrict something else, so we'll restrict that and de-restrict that. So for example, if there were, I think to people who care about gun rights and who seriously think about it, the issue isn't one gun a month. The issue isn't background checks. The issue is the ability to have guns available to defend yourself, not just in the home, but in public places. Not all public places, but most public places. In your car, walking down the street, and the like. So we have now 42 states in which that is available to pretty much any law-abiding adult. We have 8 states in which it's not. If there were something on the table that offered some degree of gun decontrol in those states, coupled with some degree of gun control on the national level, it's a valuable enough thing. You could probably get a considerable amount. Maybe, again, background checks, maybe maybe 1 gun a month and such. Then in that case, that would be a compromise. Now, my guess is that many people in gun control movement say, oh, no, this is horrible. We don't want more guns on the street. We don't want more people to be able to carry guns. And that even though it's pretty clear blood hasn't flown on the streets as a general matter just because we've shifted from 9 to 42, there certainly have been unfortunate incidents. Probably the George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin situation was in part stemmed from Zimmerman's having a concealed carry license. So I can see why people wouldn't want to do that. But if you really do want to get those other things, you need to put something on the table that the gun rights movement won't just see as a lesser loss, but an affirmative win to counteract their loss on the other thing that you want to win on. If you aren't willing to offer that, aren't willing to really to offer anything by way of positive benefit to the gun rights movement, not clear why you're going to have a compromise.
I gotta make sure he doesn't filibuster, so I gotta sit down here. So, Professor Volokh, excuse me, that was not intentional. Excuse me.
It's okay. He was
Well,
a great painter, I hear.
But exactly, it's not a terrible comparison. So I'm flattered that he's tracking the things I'm saying out in the country. What he neglected to mention was at the same Connecticut forum where I spoke, I said flat out that I think the gun control movement has made a mistake in engaging in this discussion of a right to carry. And the reason it's made a mistake is that this is not about law-abiding citizens carrying guns. It's about breaking up illegal markets. I think the reason there is not the kind of reasoned debate that you're talking about is slightly different. Actually, I think it's greatly different. And I think it's because of what you're seeing here today. I think the NRA, back when we were doing Brady, they're very smart and they have a great communications team, and they understand that sometimes when you're losing, you got to change tactics really quickly. So as we began to make some real progress on Brady, which they had put a stake in the ground and said they were not going to ever agree to it, they quickly put in an amendment called the Staggers Amendment, which required that if the Brady bill passed, which was at that point a 7-day background check, the United States Department of Justice would have to create an instant background check, like a swipe of a credit card, which is what ultimately happened. They were very shrewd about that because they could see the handwriting on the wall. But the other thing they understood was that they were beginning to lose ground with the American people. And they were losing ground with the American people. Don't forget, we beat them. We beat them 3 times. They were losing ground with the American people because they kept taking these irrational, in my view, these irrational positions that there should be no gun control laws whatsoever. And when I took over handgun control, one of the first things I did was go out and recruit cops to stand with us, because I knew that it would be hard for the NRA to argue against the guys in blue, and that ultimately turned out to be quite effective. So the NRA understood that they were having trouble arguing against licensing, blah, 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 all the things I talked about. So they started switching to the ban conversation. And they set up this straw man saying they really want to ban all guns. They really want to ban all guns. And that has been the unrelenting mantra ever since we got Brady through the Congress. So I think the answer to your question is we need to break through to lawful gun owners. We need to convince lawful gun owners in the same way we convince law enforcement that this is not a ban movement, that the things we want are the things I said. And the reason I can tell you that is we put out a bill, as the professor mentioned, called Brady 2, which encompassed all the things we wanted. If we can get gun owners, and I know they're there because the polling is starting to show more and more support, to come our way, I think you will then have the sort of reasoned debate that you yearn for, that I yearn for, and I think America yearns for. I would love to think it's as simple as the professor said, that if we put carry on the table, everything else falls into place. I doubt that's true, but if that were true, that would be great news. I think it's about gun owners. Carry meaning if the gun control movement were, sorry, if, you know you're saying, okay.
Yes, a little bit back.
So I guess my question is, why is compromise relevant? Like, it seems like a misleading way to frame the question, in that shouldn't we be sitting here discussing what is good policy and then attempting to enact good policy? So if it's good policy, if it doesn't actually restrict the right to own a gun, and we accept that the right to own a gun is something that's desirable, but it does make it more difficult for criminals to get guns, to have mandatory background checks, why would anyone want not to have background checks? Why would you oppose it or hold out for getting something that increases rights if it's a positive policy, and if it's not, don't you have to articulate the argument for why background checks are bad policy, as opposed to just saying my side needs something on the table instead?
Sure. So I think there are two reasons. One is, in fact, a lot in the gun rights movement don't think that virtually any of this is going to be good policy, because they're going to say it's like prohibition. You can ban things, it just means a black market. Already there is something of a black market in guns, that instituting universal background checks, they sincerely think is going to have virtually no benefit. Now, you might say, well, it has no benefit, what's the big deal if it has no cost? But the fact is they've listened to people like Josh Sugarman, who has indeed said that our goal is to basically try to strengthen handgun restrictions more broadly. They listened to the old Pete Shields. I guess they didn't hear. I hadn't, and I've been following the debate for a while. This is the first step of many that will get to something else. They've listened to Charles Krauthammer. You know, if enough people do say, there are lots of other such groups, do say we want a handgun ban, the fact that Richard is much more middle of the road doesn't really make the gun rights supporters feel completely safe. So their view is there is a very little upside because we think these laws will not be complied with. The real problem is criminals, and criminals don't follow the law. And we think there's a possible downside. Sometimes in particular things that it may just make, there are always false positives with every background check. There's always some extra hassle, extra expense and such. But on top of that, there's this risk that some in the gun control movement are going to do exactly what they said they wanted to do, which is try to push this further and further. So I think that's why they worry. And if there were a compromise, then that's something will make them worry less, because they say if it's not painted as a total defeat that makes us look less powerful for the next battle, but as each side got something, that's something that's more likely to be politically viable.
Yeah.
I have a question for Mr. Aborn. Actually, I have two. One is, let's say there are restrictions or heavy restrictions. Do you envision it stopping there to say, oh, we only restrict it and never go any further, or do you think it might open a slippery slope, maybe 10 or 20 years later, we eventually it leads to a ban? And the second question is, let's say we do have restrictions. In what way do you see this interrupting the supply chain for criminals and dangerous people like would-be killers?
Is this on?
Yeah.
No. They disagree. Oh, I will.
I'm a trial lawyer by training. I'm more comfortable on my feet. Those are two very good questions. So, on the ban issue again, I frankly, the piece that I would welcome, which I have racked my brain to try and figure out, and maybe somebody has a very smart answer to this, is I would love to embrace some legalistic mechanism, probably not constitutional, but something short of constitutional, that would in essence send the message there won't be a ban on guns. I would embrace that. I don't know what it is, because a current Congress can't bind future Congresses, but in theory a current Congress could pass a law saying, there won't be a ban on guns. I would support that, as long as there were other restrictions. Short of that, I don't know how you stop this, because you realize every time I get up, the response is it's a ban. It's all about a ban. The same thing you hear about gay marriage, you hear about choice, and you hear this about every single social policy. So if someone come up with that, I would embrace that. The reason you hear this term Brady 2 was that I was very conscious of this growing ban argument when we passed Brady 1. So I immediately pulled together our team and we came up with a comprehensive bill, which we ended up calling Brady 2. You all know why it's Brady, right? It was Jim Brady is the leader of the movement with his wife Sarah. Jim Brady was shot during the assassination attempt on President Reagan. He's a lifelong Republican, not exactly a left-wing radical out there, total non-gun banner. Sarah's a total non-gun banner. We put out Brady 2 and said, this is the end game. The professor before referred to a comment that I had made that if we pass Brady 2, the gun control movement goes out of business. We meant that. That's what we wanted. But I would love the legalistic intervention to send that message. Why do we think that the laws we advocate would be helpful? Because they're working now. Again, we have a very narrow thing we have to accomplish. We have to focus on that moment when the gun goes from the lawful retail hand into the illegal hand. And we have seen in states that have passed vigorous licensing mechanisms that they've broken up that moment. New York has the Sullivan Law, goes back again to 1911. Very, very few criminals get their guns from gun retailers in the state of New York. And you see that throughout the United States in states that have strong gun control laws. The bad guys get their guns from states with weak gun control laws, and it's no accident, it's because the gun control laws work. We are trying to put impediments in that moment of the transference from legality to illegality, and we have lots of examples around the country of where that is working. So that's why we think it would be effective.
Yes, so I have a two-part question. The first is, does the gun control movement accept the idea of cost-benefit analysis? And the second part is, with the continuing advent of 3D printing, how does this change, would this change your opinion on gun control, because it will become much more expensive to police gun control because people can make guns in their home?
So I don't think you can be in the public policy arena and not accept cost-benefit. I think you're just foolish not to do that. And I've looked at this issue every which way you can. I've looked at all the studies, and to me it's crystal clear. I've also seen how law enforcement has flocked to the gun control side because they know they have to do everything they can to help us break up the illegal markets. So absolutely, we support a cost-benefit analysis. Having said that, this is not pure economics. And one of the problems that you have is that cause and effect is notoriously difficult to tease out. Direct cause and effect is notoriously difficult to tease out in these social science areas because causation can exist across a wide spectrum of activities. So with that in mind, we sometimes have to look to more almost qualitative evidence and quantitative evidence in thinking about this, including the experience that we've had in the United States. 3D printers are a complication, for sure. This is all brand new. We have not seen them used in any great numbers. In theory, they can be used. There is some activity being discussed about preventing the, if you will, the printing of a gun, as crazy as that is, without a license, without a manufacturer's license. I suspect that's what's going to happen. But it doesn't change my view about the overall legislative scheme that we talked about. I think you do need it, and you need to be able to address these new technologies.
Yeah.
From Volokh, aside from the slippery slope argument, is there any rational public policy argument against a ban on assault weapons? What do they do that other types of guns can't that we want to guard?
That's kind of like asking, is there any rational public policy argument against a ban on vodka? Because after all, lots of crimes are committed under the influence of vodka. And indeed, if you can't get vodka, how much of a burden is it on you? You could just get gin instead, or maybe rum if you prefer that flavor. I take it one answer is there's actually something of a benefit to allowing people to have what they want, whether it's what they like to eat or consume the taste they want, or there are people who admire guns as engineering devices and sometimes as sometimes historical, although that's a different kind of gun. So generally speaking, I think there's always a rational argument against regulation if you think it's not going to do any good, which is don't interfere with what people are free to do. But the interesting point about the vodka point is it's true, if you can't get vodka, you can get whiskey, and people who don't get vodka will drink whiskey, and they'll be, in a sense, almost as happy if they're law-abiding, and almost as dangerous if they're drunks, or if they drive drunk. The same thing is true with regard to assault weapons. If you ban assault weapons, yes, it will have virtually no effect on people's law-abiding people's lawful self-defense, precisely because they could get guns that are virtually identical. Likewise, it will have virtually no effect on criminals, because even if the criminals don't get them from the black market, they will have access to other guns that are virtually identical. That is, I think, the reason that assault weapons bans, in fact, when people tried to measure them, they didn't see any measurable, provable effect, and I don't see how there could be such an effect, given that somebody who can't get a rifle with a bayonet lug, unless they really are into bayoneting, will be able to get a rifle that's just as deadly. And you're right, that both means just as effective for self-defense, but it also means just as effective for crime.
Well, I'd like to ask a question before we conclude. There have been a number of very high-profile instances of the use of guns in a violent way, killing people with Sandy hooks and that sort. And that, to a large extent, drives a lot of the public debate, because they can see availability bias when they can see that. But what I'd like to know is, in these high-profile cases, if, for example, there were universal background checks, would that have changed anything? In other words, to what extent are the proposals for increased gun control, to what extent would they have been effective in interfering with some of these high-profile situations?
It's an excellent question, and it's a good question to end on. The answer is a lot. So let me take the Adam Lanza situation. So the Sandy Hook kid. So Adam, as is true of many of the kids, and they are kids, that are involved in these mass shootings, which, by the way, tends to be, interestingly enough, a suburban phenomenon and not an urban phenomenon. If you think about the mass shootings in the United States at schools. One of the laws that we strongly support is a requirement, as I said earlier, that gun owners keep their guns locked up. The guns that Adam Lanza got were his mother's guns that had been lawfully acquired. So a background check would not have had any impact. However, by everything we now know from the state police investigation, she appeared to be someone who complied with the law. Unfortunately, there was no requirement in Connecticut that those guns be locked up, and her guns were out and accessible. So we are supportive of a law that requires that guns in the home be kept locked up and away from kids. That could have had a direct impact on that law. That law, though, however, is only good if it's really enforced, and it has to have some real teeth. So there are some states, and I forget what Connecticut has done at the moment. I don't think they have anything. Do you know? Do they have any? Yeah, they don't have any law requiring guns to be locked up. Some states have passed sort of advisory laws saying you should keep your guns locked up. Our view is that if you don't do it, it needs to be a misdemeanor, it needs to be serious, and it needs to be enforced. So that would have a very direct impact.
So let's take exactly the same scenario. So first of all, the argument is that gun owners, it's not just should keep their guns locked up if they have small children around. They should just keep their guns locked up, period. So what that means is, if you have a 20-year-old living with you, some 20-year-olds are men, some are women. Let's say a daughter of yours, and you think, I'm living in a dangerous part of town. She's 20. She's actually legally allowed to own guns at that point. Not in New York City. New York City actually bans all gun possession by under 21-year-olds, gun ownership at least. Most states allow, all other states except Illinois allow with 18 and above to have rifles or shotguns, which of course are just as deadly, probably more so for mass shootings than handguns. Many states allow handgun ownership. So even though she could own a gun on her own, you have to keep it locked up. So even if you think, look, she's trained. The problem with Adam Lanza isn't that he didn't know how to shoot. She's trained and she's in danger, and sometimes I'm not at home. It would be a crime for you to allow a law-abiding adult who is living with you to have access to your guns. That's a pretty substantial burden on self-defense. Now, but what about the possible benefit? Well, you wouldn't just have to have it locked up. You'd have to have it locked up so that it is impossible to break into it. Now, In some situations, if I lock up my liquor and I see when I come back home the lock is broken, I'm going to have a talk with my 10-year-old, and he's going to feel there's a problem. But in Adam Lanza's case, he killed his mother. So she would have had to have had a safe that was so powerful. She would have a pretty expensive safe that was that you couldn't break into, that Adam Lanza couldn't have forced her to open at knife point or some such. He was planning to kill her in any case. So it would be a pretty substantial burden on law-abiding users that they have to have basically I don't know what kind of safe, but a safe that is invulnerable to somebody who doesn't care whether he'll be caught, in fact, because he's about to commit mass murder. But even if he somehow couldn't get his hands on her guns, the question is whether somebody who is bent on mass murder would say, well, I'm willing to commit mass murder, but I'm not willing to go to the black market to get a gun. And it's not obvious, it's not trivial to go to the black market. It's probably not tremendously hard. I hear that not just 20-year-olds, but even 15-year-olds can sometimes get access to drugs. I don't want to frighten you folks, but I hear that that's so, even though drugs are completely illegal. So the question is whether it's proper, in order to try to prevent these horrific but fortunately relatively rare incidents, it's proper to basically make it impossible for somebody to share guns in the household with somebody who is lawfully entitled to actually acquire them, somebody who may actually need them for self-defense, and to require people to have multi-hundred, if not $1,000 safes that are basically invulnerable to attack. And in a position where they can't be forced to reveal this. And then, whether after you've done all that, whether you think that somebody who's willing to commit mass murder is going to be unable to find a gun on the black market. You know, I think that's not terribly likely, and I think the costs to law-abiding users are pretty substantial.
You know, it can't be that nothing will work. You know, it can't be that the answer to every single proposal is it won't work. So let's infuse some reality here. I believe this is correct. Something go out there, and I'm sure somebody will tell me if I'm wrong, but in the following: Columbine, Paducah, Lexington, Sandy Hook, Oregon, Aurora, and there's one other I'm forgetting at the moment. All of those guns were obtained legally, and by and large, I think in 90% of the cases, particularly the high school shootings, those guns were obtained from a parent. As I mentioned earlier, all of those shootings took place in suburban areas. And frankly, Sandy Hook, if you all know where it is not exactly, it's barely a suburban area, it's more of a rural area. And the notion of Adam Lanza being present of mind enough to travel to Hartford, or more likely to New York, in order to be able to get an illegal gun, which is not quite as easy as the professor would say, is frankly fanciful. He would not happen. He likely would have been deterred. He may have gone in with a knife. Do you know, by the way, that on the same day Lanza carried out that horror in Sandy Hook, a man in China went on a similar rampage and attacked, ironically, a kindergarten group full of 30 kids, and he injured 7 of them with a knife. Nobody died. There's no gun. So there's a big difference when you keep people bent on mass murder from getting weapons, particularly high-powered weapons. There's a big difference. And for this one, there's an easy solution. I think the professor also knows that for, I think, $49.95, you can buy a 3-digit lock that you can put on a weapon that you can release as fast as you can dial in the 3 digits. And there are even gun locks you can buy that are built into the handle of the gun, the butt of the gun, that you can dial in, that would comply with the CAP laws, the Child Accident Prevention laws, and that would prevent a lot of these horrors from taking place. So this notion that the gun owner is going to have to go out and buy $100,000 safes and keep them away from every single gun and never have access to them at that critical moment when they need them, frankly, is just not accurate.
Well, first of all, I didn't say 100,000. I said a couple of $100 for some safes and about 1,000 for others. As to locks, there are cheaper locks that aren't terribly effective. There are more expensive safes that are harder to use bolt cutters or an axe or something like that to break into. There, as I said, is coercion. Somebody who's willing to shoot his mother might be willing to force his mother to give up the code to the safe or to the lock. And I guess part of the problem we're asking, well, isn't it obvious, or why would anybody be against particular restrictions? Well, I guess people have very different reactions to what's plausible. To me, the idea that somebody who's willing to commit mass murder, and many of these mass murders they're not spur of the moment. They're not today, I just decided just this moment, I want to go out there and kill people. This is something that people have thought about, sometimes have fantasized about. The notion that something, I have to go to New York or to Hartford in order to get a gun. I was going to basically murder a lot of people and then basically end my own life, but just too hard to go to go find a gun. That doesn't strike me as terribly plausible. But again, as I said, that's part of the problem. The different people on these sides of the debate, part of the reason they're in different sides of the debate is they have different reactions to what they think is the factual situation.
Okay.
All right.
I think we're over time, so let me suggest that we go to the Goldman Lounge and have some drinks and food.
Okay.